Today's episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, an incredible and incredibly affordable place to watch thousands of non-fiction movies and shows. More on them in a bit. The Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area is widely known as the largest single organic structure in the world. It's located between 14.5 and 145 kilometres off of the coast of the Australian state of Queensland, and it stretches for 2,300 kilometres, roughly the distance from Boston to Miami. That's more than 7 times longer than the second longest reef in the world, the 290-kilometre long Belize Reef in the Caribbean Sea. At its shallowest areas, it's about 5 metres beneath the waves. On average, though, it's 30 metres under the water. There are many areas that plunge down to depths as low as 2,000 metres. Wherever someone chooses to dive, they should be able to get a great view, as its waters in the Pacific Ocean are noted for being unusually clear. As clear as the look we're going to take at the Great Barrier Reef, from its distant past through its tumultuous present to its likely future. As it happens, the label Great Barrier Reef is a bit misleading. To be sure, there's a lot of coral in there, roughly 10% of the world's supply of coral. The coral polyps that compose them come in around 600 different species, with hard coral comprising about 360 species of them spread along 3,000 reefs. That includes about 300 coral cays, which are areas where the hard coral has grown in such abundance that it has breached the surface and formed an island. But for all that abundance and variety, only about 7% of the GBR is covered by coral, with the GBR at roughly 214,000 square kilometers, about 10% larger than the state of New Mexico. That leaves 14,982 square kilometers covered by coral, about the same size as the state of Vermont. So, when you read the oft-quoted fact about the GBR, that it's the only organic structure that can be seen from space, bear in mind that the vast majority of what you're seeing isn't, strictly speaking, an organic structure. The kinds of terrain that actually comprise most of the GBR include beds of seagrass, expanses of algae, and huge sand bars. There are also vast collections of more than 5,000 varieties of sponges, which cover whole areas of the ocean floor. According to BarrierReefAustralia.com, coral reefs are home to roughly a quarter of all varieties of marine life. There are several most prominent varieties of life on the GBR, known as the Great Eight. The most well-known and populous being the iconic clownfish, potato cod, which are the largest bony fish found on the reef, manta rays, which are reportedly smart enough to see gauge from divers if fishing equipment gets caught on them, and many species of shark. There's also the very distinctive-looking Maori wrasse with its hump head and big lips. The GBR contains 6 of the 7 known species of sea turtle. To many, the most significant form of life common to the GBR is whales, an estimated 10,000 of which make annual journeys from the Antarctic Ocean to carve in the GBR, particularly the humpback and dwarf minke whales. Last but certainly not least, there are the world's largest species of giant clams, which often weigh about 450 pounds and live as long as 100 years. This is, of course, only the tip of the iceberg, as an estimated 1,500 species of fish and more than 5,000 species of mollusk overall live on the GBR. To get an idea of the fish and mollusk populations that call the GBR home, an estimated 350 billion starfish alone live there. A few millennia ago, though, there were thousands and thousands of very different but quite familiar permanent occupants, ones which lived lifestyles which would be unthinkable given its current conditions. Nevertheless, they left behind solid evidence of their presence. The historical accounts largely come from the Aboriginal people of mainland Australia and the Torres Islanders. The two groups left written records and oral traditions of living in present-day Great Barrier Reef territory. They primarily sustained themselves through hunter-gatherer lifestyles, with emu being a particularly prized game bird. The absence of water that made this lifestyle possible was largely due to mass freezing from the previous ice age. The vastly varied terrain was further shaped to a significant degree by sediments from the Great Divide, Australia's largest mountain range. When the Great Melt began roughly 7,000 years ago, it drove people onto hundreds of pieces of high ground that became islands, and even many of those shrunk as much as 75% before the melt-off in the northern hemisphere stopped flooding the south. While there is evidence that Chinese explorers looked for creatures to grind into medicine and Japanese pearl divers had been exploring the GBR for centuries beforehand, the structure first became known to Europeans when Captain James Cook of the HMS Endeavour stumbled upon it. There's no better way to put it than say stumbled upon, because it was discovered by the ship running aground on June 11, 1770 at 11 p.m. It was no trivial matter for the crew. In an attempt to lighten the ship while the hole in the hull was dealt with, Cook had 6 artillery pieces, barrels and provisions, and even valuable oil thrown overboard. In all, it would total more than 48 tons of supplies, and even with that sacrifice, they still had to wait 23 hours before the shifting tide allowed the vessel to move again. In desperation, the crew had taken down one of the ship's sails to use as a plug while seeking land. Ironically, the very chunk of coral that caused them so much trouble was the ship's salvation, as it broke off from the reef and helped keep the flow of water manageable with pumps. After arriving at the relative safety of the site of modern-day Cooktown, the crew spent the next 6 weeks on repairs. The Endeavour almost ran aground on another patch of the GBR on August the 16th, 1770. It would take 3 months of navigation through a maze of narrow straits before Cook's crew was free of it. Such was the significance of finding a reliable passage that Cook dubbed it Whit Sunday, the English term for the beginning of Pentecost, as if the discovery had a religious component to it. There were likely few people that hated the reef more than its first Western explorers, though considering that Cook returned to it for 2 further expeditions, he seemed to manage whatever grievances he held. In 1831, Charles Darwin was aboard the HMS Beagle for an exploration of the GBR after the completion of his much more famous charting of the coasts of South America that inspired his landmark work on evolution. At the time, there was considerable controversy over the odd growth patterns of coral, especially in regards to the GBR. Were they the result of volcanic activity, sediment, etc.? Darwin's theory would ultimately marry the 2 main notions, and according to Wired magazine, suggests that coral deposits were largely the result of land settling as volcanoes went dormant or extinct, the loss of heat and magma causing the crust to contract. As benign as the debate may seem today, when Darwin returned to England in 1837, he found himself embroiled in the first great scientific controversy of his life when he published his proposal. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that scientific consensus settled largely in Darwin's favor. For a huge patch of microscopic creatures that barely move, the coral of the GBR has been capable of causing a great amount of drama in the scientific community. While many of Darwin's theories were vindicated, his studies were definitely hindered in their depth of investigation by limitations of time and technology. It wouldn't be until almost a century later that a rigorous survey with modern scientific methods would be launched. Spanning from 1928 to 1929, it was variously known as the Great Barrier Reef Expedition, the Young Expedition, and the Cambridge Expedition. It consisted of 12 researchers working full-time with intermittent support from 19 additional scientists analyzing the coral, its growth patterns, etc. It took 13 months of grueling work, largely based out of the Low Isles, 64 kilometers from the mainland. Ironically, the scientist from Cambridge University who led the expedition was Maurice Young, an expert on oysters and other mollusks who confessed that prior to the expedition, just like Darwin, he'd never so much as seen a reef in person before leading a groundbreaking study of them. And even he seemed like the perfect person for the job compared to team members such as Charles Ward, an American dancer and actor whose main qualification was that he collected crabs for the Australian Museum. It was also no secret that the expedition was as much about studying the economic potential of the reef as anything else, since it wouldn't be until the 1950s that the GBR became a tourism goldmine. Still, it was a landmark study for oceanography the world over, and there's no arguing with the results. Now, being a viewer of this channel, I bet you're the sort of person who loves to learn new things. Well, me too. It's one of the reasons that I started this channel. And hey, if you want to go further with your learning, then you should definitely check out today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that isn't filled with low-quality junk and crappy reality TV. It's a collection of some of the best documentary and educational content from all around the world. It's available on whatever device you have, whether that's a Roku, Apple TV, Chromecast, whatever, plus you can access it worldwide, no geo restrictions. Now, one of the neat things about Curiosity is that in addition to their huge library of existing content, they're always adding new and great documentaries. I had a look at what they'd recently released, and I've already added a bunch of new stuff to my queue. For example, and this is the most clickable title in the world, The Moon Landing and the Nazis, which looks at the role Nazi technology had in the journey to the moon. That's going to be a fascinating one. I'm already looking forward to it, and that is just one random example. So go to curiositystream.com/geographics for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for you guys, use the promo code GEOGRAPHICS and you'll save 25%, which comes out to only $14.99 a year, which is just $1.25 per month, which frankly is ridiculously cheap. And now back to today's video. The marine park status. The designation of the GBR as a marine park was a long, politically fraught process. Beginning in the mid-1960s, the GBR was being heavily studied for deep-sea drilling and mining operations. Reportedly, nearly 80% of the current area was marked for oil leases. Premier Joe Belt Peterson's main objection to that state of affairs was that the entire reef hadn't been leased. In 1967, he was filmed saying that it would be quite safe to drill, and compared any worries about it to being worried about boarding a plane. Around the same time, a collection of oil disasters such as the Santa Barbara, California and the Torrey Canyon English Channel spills raised deep-sea environmental concerns. Despite these events and campaigning by indigenous islanders around the GBR area, the main driving force behind the campaign to set aside the territory for tourism and study was an influx of underwater images in films, magazines and other popular culture, along with scuba diving equipment becoming affordable for casual consumers. Yet public support for the movement in and of itself was not enough to overcome a major political roadblock. In 1972, the Labour Party gained a majority in Australian Parliament and had campaigned on park protections for the region, and there was support for the effort in the Liberal Party on the right as well. However, the state government of Queensland sharply rejected the effort. For one thing, the action would have been without legal precedence in Australian history. Furthermore, the state government argued it would have been an encroachment on their authority by the federal government. Multiple steps were needed to outmaneuver them. The first was the passage of the 1973 Seas and Submerged Lands Acts of 1973, which gave the federal government authority over territory a certain distance and depth from a certain state. This is why the closest areas of the GBR are 14.5 kilometers from the mainland, as mentioned earlier. The second was the 1975 Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act, which banned mining and drilling inside the marine park area. It first had to pass Parliament and then be upheld by the Australian High Court. Such was the tricky legal manoeuvring that went into saving the lives of trillions of coral polyps. That's not to say that all life in the GBR is necessarily considered worth preserving at all times. Even conservationists can wage determined campaigns against certain creatures. As we'll see, it's a fragile biosphere which rests in the crosshairs of many problems. Starfish are particularly noteworthy because in the past century, they have become a major problem for the coral of the GBR. In 1962, it was first observed that a species known as Crown-of-thorns starfish would eat as much as 9.75 square meters of coral per year. In the past, the Crown-of-thorns starfish's population had been kept in check by a number of predators, but the invertebrate was uniquely capable of absorbing chemical runoffs from Australian farms and other businesses, so it had thrived as its predators died off or moved away. These starfish were reported to have picked as many as 150 reefs clean in well under a decade and damaged hundreds of others. To combat this threat, local farmers have been pressured to move from employing the chemicals that contribute to Crown-of-thorns population explosions. The effort proved insufficient, so scientists turned to rougher measures. In 2015, researchers in James Cook University discovered that 20 milliliters of vinegar injected into the starfish would be enough to kill them cost-effectively, and so a $37.5 million program was launched to have divers hunt down and inject the coral-threatening creatures. Considering that Crown-of-thorns starfish get their name from the venomous spines that have been known to cause paralysis that can last hours, it was an interesting inversion of the status quo to inject poison into them instead. They'd put down roughly 350,000 by 2018 before the more cost-effective solution of sending the robot Rangerbot to cull starfish populations was adopted. Apparently intrigued by the technological possibilities, Google contributed a grant of $750,000 to the anti-starfish campaign. By November 2018, Rangerbot's duties expanded beyond killing starfish. It was used to reseed reefs which had been picked clean. It's a grim business, but thus are the moral complexities of fighting nature to save nature. As distinct of a problem as Crown-of-thorns starfish are for GBR coral, they're hardly the biggest threat faced. Coral is subject to a condition known as bleaching. That's when coral is under temperature conditions outside their usual tolerance ranges, and as a result, it releases the colorful algae inside its cells. Less often, this also is caused by pollutants. The coral of the GBR has been so affected by this condition that in the heat waves of 2016, 17, and 2020, mass bleaching events left roughly 2/3 of it pure white. This is hardly unique to the GBR, as in 2005, a similar event in the Caribbean Sea killed roughly half the coral surveyed off the coast of Belize. A 2022 study found that roughly 90% of the GBR coral had been bleached. As grim a sign as that statistic is for the GBR's coral supply, many officials are holding out hope. While bleaching is certainly an extremely unhealthy state for coral, it's very often not fatal. In 2022, Chief Scientist David Wachenfeld of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Authority said that the 2020 mass bleaching event was notable for its low mortality rate among the coral, and that the indications were that the 2022 event would be the same. However, he noted that 2016 and 2017, by contrast, had alarmingly high mortality rates. As CNN reported in 2020, roughly 50% of the coral in the GBR had been killed off in the previous 3 decades. In 2021, a delegation was sent by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization to determine whether the GBR should be removed from the World Heritage List because sufficient action was not being taken to protect it. Fortunately, it kept its designation. Surprisingly, even beyond the dangers climate change presents to the coral of the GBR, the Washington Post reported in 2020 that there is a greater, more direct danger to coral populations. That threat is tropical storms. In 2017, even as the deadly bleaching event took place, the southern region of the GBR was struck by Cyclone Debbie. Even dozens of meters underwater, the churn was absolutely devastating for many observed reefs. The Australian Institute of Marine Science found that when it surveyed 7 reefs along the Whitsunday Strait, 60 to 70% of the areas lost all of their coral. 7 reefs lost 95% of their populations. Based on the projected damage, it was estimated that the region wouldn't recover from that specific damage until 2027. What's more, with 257 km/h winds, Cyclone Debbie was only a Category 4 cyclone. Imagine the damage that could be inflicted if these ecosystems were hit by a Category 5 storm. Still, it's not as if the GBR has been only a passive entity through all these calamities, particularly in relation to humanity. Since the Endeavour was nearly its first officially recorded victim in 1770, the Reef has claimed approximately 1,200 ships as of 2020. To put that in better perspective, the infamous Bermuda/Devil's Triangle has only claimed about 50 ships as of 1974, and at 804,000 square kilometers, it's more than 3 times the size of the GBR. Even though only 114 of those lost ships were later accounted for, there's not so much sense of mystery as to why these ships were sunk in the waters that possess an abundance of mounds and fossilized coral. Still, considering that in 2010 the Chinese coal carrier Shenyang-1 alone, over the course of 9 days, left a path of destroyed coral about 3.2 kilometers long and 251 meters wide in its wake, along with further damage of spilled oil, it's hard to see an anthropomorphized version of the GBR as the villain here. For all the harm humans and the GBR have inflicted on each other, there's no question that the heritage site has been a boom as well, especially in Australia. The Great Barrier Reef Foundation ran the numbers and found that in 2015 to 2016, the 3 million tourists that visit Australia with the express intent of visiting the reef are about 1/3 of Australia's total annual tourists. That's despite the fact that only roughly 7% of the GBR is practically accessible to tourists. These tourists contribute roughly $6.4 billion, and work directly related to the GBR employed 39,000 Australians. That was more than double the jobs provided by the gas and oil industry, albeit with lower pay per capita on average. The estimated value for the resources that can be practically harvested from the GBR is between $42 and $56 billion, which would mean it's worth about 12 Sydney Opera Houses, as the foundation rather defensively put it. With this in mind, the announced 2022 $1 billion relief package passed by the Australian government is maybe less about providing a vital service to the environment and cultural heritage as it is about asset management. How likely is it that the GBR will be drilled for oil or mined for limestone in our lifetime? There are indications it's more likely than it might seem. In 1998, it was reported that the prospect was under consideration as Australia's oil supplies were projected to be depleted by 2012, and Queensland Mines and Energy Department was seeking appraisals to mine and drill sections of the GBR, and that it did take the initiative to provide 3 oil shell leases near Whitsunday and Gladstone, which is practically allowing drilling right on the borderline of the GBR. While Australia has obviously managed to avoid exhausting its oil supplies, it's not difficult to imagine a shortage or major disruption to the supply chain, spurring the Queensland government or even the federal government from ignoring the 1975 law altogether. If they do, there are many groups that the Queensland government would need to get through. Today, Aboriginal and Torres Islanders continue caretaker duties for the Great Barrier Reef Heritage Site. In recent years, the 70-some environmental preservation organisations they run have been more assertive in enforcing sustainable use of the Great Barrier Reef area, such as strictly regulating fishing and tourists collecting coral as souvenirs. They have demonstrated significant tenacity in protest efforts such as stopping multi-billion-dollar Carmichael mining projects in 2015 and stopping Queensland coal port expansion projects. As far as human advocates go, the GBR could certainly do worse. Whether it be by the works of man or the uncaring acts of nature, the GBR is a constantly threatened ecosystem. However many golden eggs it has provided to Australian scientific research, tourism, and the economy overall, it's still a goose that the government has indicated it's quite willing to kill for oil and limestone. It is a colourful region that can lose much of its colour in a single year, and yet it has shown itself resilient enough to grow from almost nothing in a few thousand years. Its abundance of varied flora and fauna should be appreciated to the fullest extent, while they still can.